Hello everyone and welcome back. It's been quite a while again since the last video. In the meantime, I have traveled back from Japan, which was a very exciting experience, and come back to Switzerland. Then I've also been to Portugal. Last weekend, Elena and I tied the knot in Portugal, and that was a beautiful experience. I'll share more thoughts and impressions from that in an upcoming episode. But for now, I want to talk about work. It's been quite a while since I last talked about work. I last talked about my role in Dfinity, and I am still a big supporter of the project as well as an investor in the project, and I do believe in the success of Dfinity. But earlier this year, I decided to leave my operational role to focus again on being an investor. What I found is that being an investor for me is just the ideal role because it allows me to, on one hand, have a very high-level view and be in touch and help various companies and learn from various companies at the same time. That's the one thing that I always try to optimize for. And at the same time, it allows me to go down the rabbit hole on specific projects and ideas every now and then and really dig deep and get really close with one topic. But then also be able to also step back, hand it off to someone else in that company that's operational and focus on a high level, a new project again. Before I'm going to talk about my new investment company and philosophy, I want to give you an idea of how I first became an investor, because that's a question that I've been asked quite a few times in the past. So I started being fascinated with technology companies a very, very long time ago. Even before I started Mediasign, I was already reading Techcrunch, and that must have been 10 or 15 years ago now. And reading on Techcrunch about funding rounds and how startups and founders led their companies to success and how they pivoted has always been fascinating to me and always seemed like a great learning opportunity. At the time I was running Mediasign, Fabian is my co-founder in Mediasign, Fabian and I often were asked if instead of taking cash from young companies, if we would take a stake in their company in exchange for the services that we provided with Mediasign. Now, we always had to say no because we had salaries to pay on the other end in Mediasign. Our graphic designers and project managers, they need to be paid in cash, and so taking stock was not really an option. If you take stock, of course there's a certain upside, there's a good chance that that stock will multiply its value over time, but there's also a risk that it will go down to zero, be worthless, and so we couldn't really take that risk as Mediasign. But then about 5 years ago, at the beginning of 2014, Fabian and I decided to start a separate company called Tenderloin Ventures, with which we would invest in startups, not only money, but also a lot of my time for two benefits. One, to better the chances of those startup success, and then second, also for me to learn a lot about how a particular startup did and worked, because that gave me the opportunity to transfer the learnings I made in one company and bring them over to another company. And that was the concept of Tenderloin Ventures. We set out with about 4 million Swiss francs to invest in about 10 companies over the course of roughly 3 years was the time plan or the timeline that we set for us, and then see how those investments did. At the time, we formulated two investment theses. On one hand, we wanted to invest in e-commerce, high margin niche markets in Switzerland. The reason for that being is that Amazon doesn't have a big presence in Switzerland. There's some products you can order from the German website, but it's still a bit of a cumbersome process to get the products to Switzerland because there's customs and long shipping durations and so on and so forth. So we thought that there's a big market opportunity for e-commerce in Switzerland, especially in niche markets. And then second, to invest in SaaS companies, or to put it more broadly, to invest in companies that once they were up and running could serve 1,000 to 10,000 additional customers by adding one staff to the company. Examples for that would be ZenJob, Frontify, or Yodel, the social network. So during the 3 years between 2014 and then of 2016, I spent all my time with those projects. A, looking for good projects to invest, and then B, with those projects to create value and learn from them, as I mentioned. After we invested the roughly 4 million Swiss francs, we decided to take a step back and see how our picking was and if our theses will prove to be right. And that's when I went into Dfinity, Sentask, and Glimpse, and helped 3 new companies get off the ground. Then last year, which was year number 5 for Tenderloin, was a very interesting year because we were able to partially exit 2 of our companies and fully exit 1 of our investments. And that showed that our theses were indeed right and proved to be valuable. That's what eventually triggered me to take a step back from my operational role at Dfinity, let people take over that are much better at running companies of 100 employees or more, and go back on focusing on investments. Okay, let's jump to now. So now I'm setting up a new vehicle, again together with Fabian, and also his brother is joining these efforts. And we are going to invest in 2 categories. Number 1, we're also going to do venture capital, meaning we're going to invest in early stage young tech companies. Specifically, we're going to focus on B2B SaaS companies. Now, before I dive into why B2B SaaS, the other category that we're going to focus on, what right now is a lot more loosely defined, is private equity. Now, theoretically, every company, a share that you hold that is not a public company is private equity. But in a more practical way, private equity means later stage companies that already have significant turnover and ideally profits, and buying larger shares in them. Typically, when we invest in venture capital, we take a minority share. That could be somewhere between 5 and 25% when you first invest. And in private equity, typically you want to either buy a company outright or at least acquire a majority stake and take control of the company, with the goal that you would use the existing team, the existing assets to make the company even better, grow it further, and then eventually sell it again. Now, I mentioned that first because that area is a lot more less defined. It's where I have a lot less experience, but also what I'm very curious about and just want to learn a ton about. So if there's someone here listening to this video that has a lot of experience in private equity and knows some good books or people I should talk to or podcasts I should listen to, then please do recommend them. Send them to me via private message or via the comments. Now back to the venture capital part of it. I mentioned that we're going to invest in B2B SaaS startups. Now, what does that stand for? B2B means business to business. So it's companies that sell to other companies. And then SaaS, S-A-A-S, means software as a service. Typically what that defines is that instead of selling software product once, and someone owns it outright, these companies would sell a software as a service, meaning there's a recurring fee, something like Spotify or Netflix, something that you pay for monthly, but not as a consumer, as a company. If you look at previous investments that I've done, then ZenJob or Frontify are prime examples for these types of companies. So why do we focus on this area? While B2B sales is typically harder, meaning there's longer sales cycles and it involves a lot more personal touches and communication, you also have very stable contracts, meaning it might take you 6 months to close a contract with a company, but once you've closed that, it's very often the case that the company stays a customer for many years. Whereas in the B2C segment, business to consumer, you might sell purely through online channels, Facebook, Instagram marketing, or on your website. But then also consumers tend to be a lot more jumpy in their decisions. So they might subscribe to Spotify for 3 months and then jump to Apple Music if there's a discount there. It's a lot less predictable. A second factor in especially the sales aspect is that typically your customer acquisition costs will vary a lot with your competition in a B2C environment. So while it's a very scalable model because you don't need a lot of people, it also means you're very dependent on your competition and the channels you're selling through. In the B2B world, however, even though sales cycles are long, it's pretty constant the effort you need to take to close a sale. Whether there's an additional competitor or not doesn't move the needle that much. It might prolong your cycle a bit, it might cause you to create additional materials or change your pitch or strategy slightly, but not to the extent where you double or triple your costs of acquiring a customer. And the last point why B2B is so elegant is that I think there's a very high percentage of knowledge that you learn in one company about the sales process that you can transfer to another company. So whether you're selling a SaaS software for tax optimization or one for brand style guides like Frontify does, I think the playbook overall, the learnings are very similar. Whereas in the B2C world, you might see that one product sells really well on Facebook, but another product only sells on Google AdWords or Google, and therefore your playbooks are completely different and there's not much learning that you can transfer from one company to another. Alright, I'm super excited for this new opportunity. I will tell you more along the way as this opportunity develops and as I'm looking at first investments, making first investments, and refining my thinking about both venture capital and private equity. And in the meantime, please get in touch if you either run or know of any good company that I should have a look at that fits those criteria. That's a B2B SaaS company. And my second request is if you're looking at this and you think it's interesting to hear more about how does an investor think, how do you invest, what are the terms you negotiate, what's the process of first meeting a founder up until you invest, then please also let me know via private message or down here in the comments. And with that, I'll talk to you soon.